This proposes the right to education, also for girls, who are excluded in certain places.
She doesn't look very appreciative.
The right to education, which is ensured first and foremost by respecting and reinforcing the primary right of the family to educate its children, as well as the right of churches and social groups to support and assist families in the education of their boys and girls. Education conceived in this way is the basis for the implementation of the 2030 agenda and for reclaiming the environment.
Al mismo tiempo,
At the same time, government leaders must do everything possible to ensure that all can have the minimum spiritual and material means needed to live in dignity and to create and support a family, which is the primary cell of any social development. In practical terms, this absolute minimum has three names: lodging, labor, and land. And one spiritual name: spiritual freedom, which includes religious freedom, the right to education, and all other civil rights. Now, for all this, the simplest and best measure and indicator of the implementation of the new agenda for development will be effective, practical, and immediate access on the part of all to essential material and spiritual goods: housing, dignified and properly remunerated employment, adequate food, and drinking water, religious freedom, and more generally, spiritual freedom and education. Now, these pillars of integral human development have a common foundation, and this is the right to life and, more generally, what we could call the right to existence of human nature itself.
La crisis ecológica,
the ecological crisis, together with the large-scale destruction of biodiversity, can threaten the very existence of the human species. The baneful consequences of an irresponsible mismanagement of the global economy, guided only by the ambition for wealth and power, must serve as a summons to a forthright reflection on man. Man is not only a freedom which he creates for himself. Man does not create himself. He is spirit and will, but also nature. Creation is compromised, where we ourselves have the final word. The misuse of creation begins when we no longer recognize any instance above ourselves, when we see nothing else but ourselves. Consequently, the defense of the environment and the fight against exclusion demand that we recognize a moral law written into human nature itself, one which includes the natural difference between man and woman and the absolute respect for life in all its stages and dimensions. Without the recognition of certain incontestable natural ethical limits, and without the immediate implementation of those pillars of integral human development, the ideal of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war and of promoting social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom risks becoming an unattainable illusion, or even worse, just idle chatter, which serves as a cover for all kinds of abuse and corruption, or for carrying out an ideological colonization by the imposition of anomalous models and lifestyles which are alien to people's identity and, in the end, are irresponsible. War is the negation of all rights, and it's a dramatic assault on the environment. If we want true integral human development for all, we must work tirelessly to avoid war between nations and between peoples.
Para tal fin, hay que asegurar
To this end, there is a need to ensure the uncontested rule of law and tireless recourse to negotiation, mediation and arbitration as proposed by the Charter of the United Nations, which constitutes truly a fundamental juridical norm. The experience of these 70 years since the founding of the United Nations in general, and in particular the experience of these first 15 years of the third millennium, reveal both the effectiveness of the full application of international norms and the ineffectiveness of their lack of enforcement. When the Charter of the United Nations is respected and applied with transparency and sincerity and without ulterior motives as an obligatory reference point of justice, and not as a means for masking spurious intentions, peaceful results will be attained. When, on the other hand, the norm is considered simply as an instrument to be used whenever it proves favorable, and then to be avoided when it is not, a true Pandora's box is opened, releasing uncontrollable forces which gravely harm defenseless populations, the cultural milieu, and even the biological environment. The preamble and the first article of the Charter of the United Nations set forth the foundations of the international juridical framework:
la solución pacífica de las
peace,
controversias,
the pacific solution of disputes, and the development of friendly relations between nations.
contrasta fuertemente con estas
Now,
afirmaciones.
strongly opposed to
Y
such
las niega
statements,
en la práctica,
and in practice denying
la
them,
tendencia
is the
siempre presente
constant tendency to the
proliferación
proliferation
de las armas,
of arms,
especialmente
especially
las de destrucción
weapons of
masiva,
mass
como
destruction,
pueden ser las
such as
nucleares.
nuclear weapons.
Una ética y un derecho
An ethics and a
basados
law
en la amenaza
based
de
on the threat
destrucción
of
mutua,
mutual destruction
posiblemente
and possibly
de toda la
the
humanidad,
destruction of all mankind
son contradictorios
are
y
self-contradictory
constituyen
and
un
represent
fraude
an
a toda la construcción
affront
de las Naciones
to the
Unidas,
entire framework
que
of the
pasarían
United
a ser
Nations,
Naciones
which would end
Unidas
up
por
as
el
a
miedo y la
nations
desconfianza.
united by fear and distrust.
Hay que empeñarse por un mundo
There
sin
is
armas
urgent need
nucleares,
to work for a world
aplicando
free of
plenamente
nuclear
el
weapons,
tratado
in
de
full
no
application of the
proliferación
Non-Proliferation
en la letra
Treaty,
y en el
in
espíritu,
letter and
hacia una
spirit,
total prohibición
towards
de
the goal of a
estos instrumentos.
complete prohibition of these weapons.
El reciente acuerdo
The recent agreement reached on the nuclear question in a sensitive region of Asia and the
es
Middle
una
East
prueba de
is
las
proof of the
posibilidades de la buena
potential
voluntad
of
política y
political
del
goodwill
derecho
and of law
ejercidos con
exercised with
sinceridad,
sincerity,
paciencia y
patience,
constancia.
and constancy.
Hago votos para que este
I
acuerdo
express my
sea
hope that this
duradero y
agreement will be
eficaz
lasting and
y dé los
efficacious
frutos
and
deseados
bring forth the
con la
desired fruits
colaboración
with the
de todas
cooperation
las
of
partes
all the
implicadas.
parties involved.
En este sentido, no faltan duras pruebas
In this
de las
sense,
consecuencias
hard evidence is not lacking of the negative effects of military and political interventions which are not coordinated between members of the international community.
Por eso, aún deseando
For this
no
reason,
tener la
while
necesidad de hacerlo,
regretting to have to
no
do
puedo
so,
dejar de reiterar
I must
mis
renew
repetidos
my repeated
llamamientos
appeals
en relación
regarding
con la dolorosa
the painful
situación
situation
de todo el Oriente
of the
Medio,
entire Middle
del
East,
norte de África,
North Africa,
de otros países africanos,
and other African
donde
countries,
los cristianos, junto
who are
con otros
Christians,
grupos
together with
culturales
other cultural or ethnic groups,
incluso junto con
and
aquella
even
parte
members
de los miembros de la religión
of the
mayoritaria
majority
que no quiere
religion
dejarse
who have no
envolver
desire
por
to
el
be
odio y la
caught
locura,
up in hatred
han
and
sido
folly,
obligados
have been
a ser
forced
testigos de
to
la
witness the destruction
de sus lugares
of
de
the
culto,
places
de
of
su
worship,
patrimonio cultural y religioso,
their cultural and
de sus
religious
casas y
heritage,
haberes,
their houses
y
and
han sido
property,
puestos en la disyuntiva de
and
huir
have faced the alternative either of fleeing or paying for their adhesion to good and to peace by their own lives or by enslavement.
Estas realidades deben constituir un
These
cierre
realities
llamado
should serve as
un
a
examen
grave
de
summons
conciencia
to an
de los
examination
que
of
están a
conscience
cargo de la
on the
conducción
part of those
de los
charged with the
asuntos
conduct of
internacionales.
international affairs,
no solo en los casos de
and
persecución
not only in
religiosa o
cases of
cultural,
religious or cultural
sino en cada
persecution,
situación
but
de
in every
conflicto,
situation of
como
conflict,
Ucrania,
as in Ukraine,
Siria,
Syria,
Irak, Libia,
Iraq,
Sudán del
Libya,
Sur,
South Sudan,
de los Grandes Lagos,
and the Great Lakes
hay
region.
rostros concretos
Real
antes que
human
intereses de
beings
parte.
take precedence over partisan interests, however legitimate the
En las
latter may
guerras y
be.
conflictos
In wars
hay
and
seres
conflicts,
humanos
there are
singulares,
individual persons,
hermanos y hermanas
our brothers and sisters,
hombres y mujeres,
men and women,
jóvenes y ancianos,
young and old,
niños y niñas
boys and
que
girls,
lloran,
who weep,
sufren y
suffer,
mueren.
and die.
Seres humanos que se
Human
convierten
beings
en
who
material
are
de
easily
descarte
discarded
cuando la
when our
actividad
only
consiste
response
solo
is to
en
draw up lists
enumerar
of
problemas,
problems,
estrategias